The rumors continue to grow surrounding Jimmy Butler and a potential Philadelphia 76ers reunion, as there seems to be a bit of a looming contractual situation down in South Beach, Miami. In this video, I want to break down the likelihood of Butler finding himself back here in South Philly playing for the Sixers once again, whether or not it's a good idea, and how we even landed in this situation in the first place. So I want to lead with the latest report, this being from Keith Pompey, saying that the Philadelphia 76ers are prepared to offer Jimmy Butler a full max extension if they land him in a trade. Now, that obviously is the biggest stipulation, that this is not a guy that the Sixers can go out and outright trade or go out and outright sign. They're going to have to trade to bring him to Philadelphia, and that being the biggest concern, is the Miami Heat are obviously going to operate in their best interest, and that their best interest is not quite handing over their best player to an Eastern Conference rival here. Now, there's a couple issues here that I do want to dive into. Number one, the thought process behind it. Obviously, we all like Jimmy. Obviously, Jimmy Butler was a guy that is one of the ones that got away as it pertains to the Sixers. That we know the relationship with Joel Embiid. We've seen him be this playoff killer that the Sixers clearly need, but there also is the factor of him now being 35. And this quote specifically was one that bothered me the wrong way from Pompey once again, that he says the Sixers regret not paying Jimmy and want to make things right. Quote, talking to my sources, the 76ers ownership group, they kind of regret what they did 5 years ago in trading Jimmy Butler, and they see the success that he's had, and they realize he could be, in their eyes, the missing piece, and they're willing to give him the money he wants. Now, in a nutshell, I have no issue with this situation. It's very clear they made a mistake, and for what it's worth, this is a completely different front office than who it was at the time of making these decisions. But it doesn't mean that paying him the money at 35 years old for the money of what you should have paid him at 29 years old is the right decision there. Now, to dive into his contract specifically, I do want to start with this, that at this point in time, he's on the books for $48.7 million next year, a $52 million player option in 25-26, and then he is contract extension eligible beyond that. Now, the Heat have expressed that they do not plan on entering negotiations or do not want to commit a max contract to him until he's able to prove that he can be on the court in a more reliable fashion. That Pat Riley took a couple quips at him during his postseason presser, mentioned that he needs to shut his mouth from talking trash when he's not on the court during that Celtics series after the Heat did steal that one game there. Also made that clear comment about him needing to be on the floor. And for what it's worth, that is a totally realistic expectation. And you have a fair complaint here as it comes with Jimmy. That looking at the games that he's played since coming to the Miami Heat, after, of course, leaving Philadelphia after that 2018-19 season, that with Miami, Jimmy Butler has played 58 games, 52 games, 57 games, 64 games, and 60 games. That is the type of criticism that is thrown at Joel Embiid. Obviously not for quite the same reasons with Jimmy Butler here. This is a situation where Jimmy Butler is comfortable coasting through the regular season. He does not care about the regular season, and then he goes into the playoff Jimmy mode come the postseason and gets ready to turn up. Now, while this has been a route for success in general for the Heat, we see what he's been able to do in the postseason, take this team to the finals in the way he has, be the alpha, that number one option that this team has commanded him to be, and he has stepped into those shoes. You cannot dispute what he's done on the court, but it is also fair to think if that is the long-term sustainable option or the type of culture you want to set. And it does seem like Jimmy is dead set on getting his money. And why we know that here, we have from Anthony Chang saying, Jimmy Butler is determined to land a max extension. Quote, Jimmy Butler wants a max extension this offseason, preferably from the Heat. But whether it's from the Heat or another team, he wants a max extension. So that is the difficult spot that these Sixers find themselves in, is they are not in control of this situation. And they're in a similar boat with Paul George there, that Paul George can just straight up take the money and stay in Los Angeles. Now, you have to really decide, is it worth it for a little bit of extra change to come to Philadelphia where the expectations change, where the situation changed? And Jimmy's in a little bit of a similar boat that I do think he likes down in Miami. He's clearly carved out a niche in a way that he has not been able to do really throughout the entirety of his NBA career, even dating back to the tenure that he spent in Chicago. Now, when talking about the Jimmy Butler situation, I do think there's a lot of revisionist history that goes down. That it is clear the Sixers made a mistake in letting him go. There's no doubt about that. But it's also hindsight is 2020, and the Jimmy Butler that we know now is not the Jimmy Butler that we knew then. That at that point in time, this was not the Sixers believed Tobias Harris was going to be a better player than Jimmy Butler. It was the Sixers realized that Tobias Harris is less problematic than Jimmy Butler. And at that point in time, looking at the history, that Jimmy had just forced himself out of 2 consecutive places and then caused kind of an issue here in Philadelphia with Ben Simmons and with Brett Brown. Now, here's the interesting part about Jimmy Butler, is in each of these situations, He's right. That the guys that he's called out, he's been absolutely right about. Dating back to Chicago, it was Fred Hoiberg, who is out of the league and has not gotten an opportunity to coach again. It was guys like Chris Dunn as a rookie who was looked at to be a part of this next generation of that Bulls team. Then flash forward to him going to Minnesota. He questioned Andrew Wiggins not being capable of being this number one option. Guess what? He was right. Karl Anthony Towns, that you're not tough enough. I think that stands the test of time as well. So then he came to Philadelphia. And then he pressed Ben Simmons. He didn't believe that he had the mental makeup to truly compete. That absolutely proved to be correct. That he didn't believe Brett Brown could be a championship coach. And while I like Brett and think he's a great human being and deserves another opportunity, he was not ready to take this team to the next level. These were all fair evaluations. But there was a pattern there. Now, looking at Jimmy Butler now in the way that we know, the way that he is fit in Miami, it's clear that the Sixers should have paid up and made that the case then, that they should have taken Jimmy Butler over Ben Simmons, which was much more of the conversation than Jimmy Butler versus Tobias Harris. Tobias got paid because the Sixers put all their assets in that same season to trade for both Tobias Harris and Jimmy Butler. And with them being free agents, you could not allow both to walk. That it would have been malpractice as an organization to invest all your assets, that at the time being the Dario Saric's of the world, the Landry Shamits, the Robert Covingtons. These were the guys they were sending out that at the time were these prized young players that were looked at positively for what they could turn into. So at that point, you could not let both walk out the door, and that is why Tobias Harris was handed one of the worst contracts in NBA history. Now, when having that Ben Simmons conversation here, it's also very clear, another hindsight is 2020 moments, that you got to take it back to these shoes. In 2018 and 19, at that point in time, Ben Simmons was coming off his second year in the NBA. In his first year, he was Rookie of the Year, won it, and in his second year, he was an All-Star. Now, knowing what we know now, he took one of the most downward slopes we've seen of any player ever. And you see the mental makeup was absolutely spot on from Jimmy. But when you're taking a gamble as an organization for a guy that you just drafted first overall, there's a little bit more of a commitment and loyalty to that player. Now, flash forward to where we're at right now. The Sixers still need to find a way to win a championship. And just about every opportunity, just about every outlook or game plan that they have laid out to take those steps has failed to this point. So it doesn't mean revisiting and bringing in Jimmy Butler is the right outlook. I hesitate to say fully yes. We got to also factor in the injury factors, him not playing, and part of my driving force, one of my biggest desires for this third star that the Sixers very clearly seem to be in search of, is I want a guy who can carry the team throughout the regular season to take some strain off Joel Embiid. That is not Jimmy Butler. That Jimmy is still going to coast to the regular season. And while the top-end talent, that dog mentality, that ability to take over is all necessary, there are some skill sets that just don't quite match up for what I need. I'm a firm believer in every player surrounding Joel Embiid needs to be a very good three-point shooter, or at least a very willing three-point shooter. Neither of those are Jimmy Butler. And to dive into the stats specifically, he did shoot a career high 41.4% from beyond the three-point arc this year, but just 2.4 three-point attempts per game. And through his career as a whole, 2.4 three-point attempts per game, just 32.9%. Now, if you want to compare him to a guy like Paul George, who has his playoff shortcomings, there's no doubt about it, that he has the opposite playoff reputation of a guy like Jimmy Butler. But you could argue that the skill set that he brings is exactly what this team needs. And by the way, just for reference in this conversation, I cannot exaggerate how much better Paul George is compared to Tobias Harris. So for those types of comparisons, and I get the concerns with the contract, it is a night and day difference for how much better that guy is. But when comparing Jimmy to Paul George, which is more of the situation these Sixers currently find themselves in, and once again, both guys far better than Tobias Harris here, there are some interesting stats that I did want to bring up. That points per game, Paul George a little bit of a better scorer. Jimmy Butler pretty much better at the other stuff, as a playmaker, as a rebounder, as a defender, absolutely. But then look at these shooting numbers. That this season, of course, Jimmy taking a bit of an edge, shooting 41.4%, but Paul George shooting 41.3%. Then look at their career. I think a more accurate representation of this, that Paul George through his career, a 39.5% versus 32.9% for Jimmy Butler there. And when talking about the three-point attempts, I just mentioned 2.4 per game for Jimmy Butler. It was 7.9 this season for Paul George, still shooting at just about a 40% clip there. That is really impressive stuff. That is high-level spacing, and that is stuff that will apply to the Sixers team. That is stuff that will maximize Joel Embiid's skill set, which should be the forefront of this conversation. Now, for a Jimmy Butler trade to happen, essentially what the Sixers need is to Jimmy Butler to pull a Jimmy Butler. They need him to kick up some dirt, cause some issues, and force his way to Philadelphia. Now, unfortunately for the Sixers, that is essentially out of their control. And also, the Miami franchise is much more equipped to handle that than the Sixers were, than the Timberwolves were, or the Bulls were. That as much as we want to laugh and joke about Heat culture, that they're going to roll with things and make sure that things are kept under wraps in a way that a lot of franchises simply have been unable to do. So for Jimmy Butler, it feels like he's going to have to really want to come to the Sixers. Now, am I saying Joel Embiid should pick up the phone and tamper right now? Absolutely. I have no issue with that whatsoever. And if these guys are as tight as they seem to be, and for what it's worth, there aren't a lot of players that seem to have that type of relationship with Joel Embiid, that Joel seems to be much more of those individualized, stay in his own lane, stay in his own world, rather than one of these networking NBA players that are constantly going out, training together, going to parties, traveling the world, all these things. That's just not Joel. That he has his family, he has his FIFA games to play, and all these other things. But if you and Jimmy still have this relationship, which all signs certainly point to, and both guys speak incredibly highly about the other, then it's time to work the phones here. And if you want to make something happen, if you want to keep your championship window open and you believe Jimmy Butler is the guy, then go and make it happen. And for Daryl Morey, if you hear that from Joel Embiid, then you make Jimmy Butler the guy. I don't know if I'm fully in on that. I still think I lean towards the skill set difference with Paul George, but it's also fair to assess that Jimmy Butler right now is closer to the Jimmy Butler in his prime than the Paul George right now to the Paul George in his prime. There's a wider gap or a larger fall off for Paul George than we've seen with Jimmy Butler. Neither guys are in their prime by any means, and that is part of that conversation, which shifts us more towards the names like Donovan Mitchell, Brandon Ingram, Lauri Markkanen, names like that, which all certainly, to be perfectly honest, might hold a little bit more of an appeal to me when speaking on the long term of this franchise. But beggars can't be choosers at this point. And the Sixers have passed up on a lot of options. The Pascal Siakams, the OG Ananobis, the guys that they didn't think weren't quite perfect. And look what happened. Both those teams went deeper in the playoffs. Both those teams had a puncher's chance that the Sixers did not this year. And for whatever cap space plan or draft picked assets, you know what either of those things are going to average in the playoffs? 0.0 points per game. So I hear it from Daryl Morey. I understand this was the game plan to put yourself in this position, but you got to strike. And if Jimmy Butler becomes available, I'm not going to be the one to say no to that. So let me know what you guys think in the comments. Is Jimmy Butler the missing piece? Will it be an overpay if the Sixers drop him that amount of cash, or are you not worried about it in kind of the same way that I am? Ultimately, we will see what happens from now. There are about to be a bunch more twists in terms of the offseason as things seem to be heating up. So make sure you are smashing that subscribe button to stick with me start from finish. Drop a like and let me know you're watching, and any other comments you have, leave them below. Appreciate each and every one of you guys for tuning in. I'll be back with you next time right here on Sixers Digest. Peace.